Ladies and gentlemen, if you are enjoying my videos, please click the like button. It is the only way the YouTube algorithm really notices me. I would be very grateful to you. Ivan stared at the map for a long time, studying the routes and evaluating each one. His usual route home took about 5 hours, but this time he needed to get back as quickly as possible. Rain was pouring down heavily, and the road ahead looked like an endless river of mud and puddles. In his mind lingered a warning from a local resident about the dead forest. "You shouldn't go there if your life is dear to you," the old man at the gas station had told him. "People disappear there, there's no road, and the forest itself is alive." Ivan smirked, considering it just another rural ghost story, but deep down, he felt unease. He decided to take the risk and turn onto that road. Time was pressing, and cutting a couple of hours off the journey seemed tempting. As he entered the forest, Ivan noticed a sharp change in the landscape. The trees stood like grim guardians, their shadows weaving into a dense canopy, blocking out the daylight. The road was indeed in terrible condition, deep ruts, mud and boulders in the way. Ivan tried to drive slowly and carefully, but even at such a speed, he had to constantly maneuver. Suddenly, his headlights illuminated something ahead. Ivan tensed, squinting through the mist, but the silhouette remained indistinct. He pressed on the gas, hoping it was just a trick of light and shadow. However, as he approached, it became clear that it wasn't an illusion. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure, or a creature, it was hard to tell. Its clothing was torn, hair disheveled, face hidden in shadow. Ivan, horrified, jerked the wheel to the right, trying to avoid a collision. The car obediently turned, but the front wheel hit a deep pothole. In the next moment, the car began to spin, losing traction with the road. The world around him spun, mixing the forest, the sky, and the ground into one continuous blur. The impact was deafening. The car flipped several times, crashing and squealing metal, until it finally came to a stop on its side. Ivan hit his head on the steering wheel, feeling sharp pain, and instantly plunged into darkness. The last thing he heard was the sound of rain pounding on metal and the faint wheeze of his own breath. He woke up from the cold. Moonlight pierced through the broken window, illuminating the inside of the car. Ivan struggled to lift his head and tried to assess the situation. The seatbelt was like a trap, holding him in place. His hands trembled as he tried to unbuckle it, but eventually he succeeded. He tumbled out of the car, falling onto the wet ground. A quiet rustle caught his attention. Around him, there was a deafening silence, broken only by the dripping of rain and the distant noise of the forest. Suddenly, he saw the silhouette again, standing at the edge of the road. Ivan froze, feeling the blood pounding in his temples. The creature, unmoving, watched him. Gathering his last strength, Ivan began to crawl away from the car, towards the nearest tree, hoping to find shelter. Every breath was accompanied by pain, but he couldn't stop. One thought flashed through his mind: survive. Ivan woke up from the piercing cold, feeling raindrops slowly trickling down his face. The headache was unbearable, as if his skull was being squeezed in a vice. He tried to get up, but his body responded with sharp pain. Every movement reminded him of multiple bruises and cuts. Ivan groaned, trying to focus. His head was spinning, and his vision was blurry. Ivan lay on the damp, leaf-covered ground, feeling the cold grass and dirt beneath him. Gradually, he began to realize that there had been an accident. Fragmented memories of losing control of the car and flipping over surfaced in his mind, adding psychological stress to the physical pain. Trying to move his arms and legs, he felt sharp pain in his left wrist and knee. There might be fractures or even breaks. The left side of his face also throbbed, especially around the cheek, indicating serious bruising. Ivan took a deep breath, trying not to succumb to panic. The rain continued to drizzle, adding cold to his condition. He tried to roll onto his side and look around. The only visible landmark was his overturned car, mangled and broken. The headlights were out, and only the moonlight filtered through dense clouds, giving him a glimpse of his surroundings in the darkness. Ivan heard the sounds of the forest, so alien and menacing. rustles, knocks, a distant howl of the wind, all of it heightened the atmosphere of fear. He needed to understand where he was and what to do next. He tried to get up on all fours, but his body didn't cooperate. Each breath was accompanied by pain in his chest, possibly indicating broken ribs. "Where am I?" he whispered hoarsely, trying to regain his senses even slightly. He knew staying in place wasn't an option. Gathering all his strength, Ivan managed to get onto his knees, leaning on his healthy arm. His head spun again, but he gritted his teeth, forcing himself not to fall back to the ground. He needed to find shelter, or at least a safe place to catch his breath and figure out how to escape from this cursed forest. Every movement was difficult, but Ivan understood he couldn't delay. Perhaps that strange silhouette that caused the accident was still nearby. This thought gave him strength, and overcoming the pain, he began to slowly move away from the wrecked car, deeper into the forest, hoping to find salvation. Ivan lay still, feeling excruciating pain all over his body. Glass shards dug into his skin. Every movement brought new torment. Summoning all his strength, he began to extricate himself from the overturned car. His fingers found the seatbelt, and he struggled to reach the buckle, which gave in only after a while. There was a click, and the seatbelt released him. Ivan collapsed onto the car's roof, experiencing a fresh wave of pain. Breathing was difficult, ribs might be broken. He grabbed onto the broken window, trying not to cut himself even more, and slowly pulled himself out. Every movement was accompanied by sharp pain in his muscles and joints. It was even colder outside. The rain didn't stop, turning the ground around into a muddy mess. Ivan got on his knees, leaning on the car, and examined his wounds. His hands and face were covered in blood. Cuts from the glass looked deep and dangerous. He realized he needed to treat them immediately, or infection was possible. Summoning his willpower, Ivan returned to the car to find the first aid kit. He had to climb back inside through the broken window, which wasn't easy due to the pain. He groped around the glove compartment and opened it, spilling the contents onto the roof. Amidst the clutter and papers, he finally found the box with the red cross. With trembling hands, he opened the first aid kit, took out antiseptic and bandages. First, he washed the cuts with antiseptic, gritting his teeth against the burning sensation. Then he started applying the bandages, trying to do it as gently as possible to stop the bleeding. Every step was difficult, but he knew it was necessary. In the first aid kit, Ivan found several painkiller tablets. He swallowed 2, washing them down with water from a bottle he found nearby. The pain subsided slightly, allowing him to think more clearly. He realized how crucial this small box of medication had turned out to be in such a situation. Preparation had saved his life. Now somewhat recovered, he looked around. The forest was grim and impenetrable, but Ivan knew he couldn't stay in one place. He had to find help to survive. Gathering his last strength, he began to move away from the car, deeper into the forest, hoping for the best and preparing for the worst. Ivan sat down, leaning his back against the overturned car. The painkiller started to work, dulling the sharp pain and allowing him to relax a little. He felt his strength gradually returning, though every breath still brought a dull ache in his chest. His wet clothes clung to his body, intensifying the sense of cold, but he knew he couldn't stay here for too long. Rummaging through his pockets, Ivan found his phone. He turned it on, hoping to call for help, but the screen didn't respond. The phone was broken, probably during the crash. He pressed the button several times, but nothing happened. Ivan gritted his teeth in frustration and anger, tossing the useless device to the ground. Now he was completely cut off from the outside world. As he stood up, Ivan felt his legs wobble from fatigue and pain, but he forced himself to take a few steps. The forest stretched around him, dark and menacing. The road he had been on was nowhere to be seen. Trees stood close together, their branches intertwining overhead, creating a thick canopy that blocked out the light. Ivan felt like the forest was closing in on him, cutting off all paths to salvation. Panic began to engulf him. He tried to remember which direction he had come from, but everything looked the same in the darkness. Without a road in sight, the feeling of disorientation only intensified. Ivan decided to try shouting, hoping someone would hear him. Help! His voice echoed through the forest, but there was no response. Somebody, help. The silence was deafening. The forest absorbed the sound, rendering his cries useless. Ivan felt fear creeping over him. He was completely alone in this dark place, and the chances of rescue seemed slim. Desperation and fear overwhelmed him. Ivan realized he was truly lost. Tears of helplessness welled up in his eyes, but he held them back, knowing it wouldn't help. He needed to act, to try to escape, to search for a way out or at least signs of civilization. Summoning all his willpower, Ivan decided to move forward, choosing a direction at random. He knew he couldn't afford to stop. Every step was difficult, but he kept going, overcoming pain and fear. The forest seemed endless, but Ivan refused to give up. His main goal now was to find an exit and save himself. Ivan kept moving forward, step by step, overcoming pain and fatigue. The forest around him seemed lifeless, but suddenly he noticed something unusual on one of the trees. As he approached, he saw a carved sign resembling a distorted pentagram. In the center of the sign was a depiction of a goat's skull, which filled Ivan with even greater unease. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, feeling a chill run down his spine. Ivan circled the tree and discovered the remnants of a campfire nearby. Charred logs and coals indicated that people had been here recently. This gave him hope, as if there were people here, there was a chance to find a way out of the forest. He carefully examined the area, hoping to find more clues or hints. Gathering his thoughts, Ivan continued on, feeling his strength waning. Hunger gnawed at him from within, and weakness became more pronounced. Time passed, and it seemed like the forest itself was changing. Ivan noticed that the trees around him were becoming increasingly strange, their shapes seeming twisted and unnatural. The sounds of nature also began to fade away. If before he could hear birds chirping and the rustle of leaves, now there was only an eerie silence. It was unnatural, and Ivan realized that something was wrong here. The forest seemed to be living its own life, changing and adapting to him. Ivan tried to keep his direction in mind, but the forest seemed to be trying to confuse him. He did his best not to lose his bearings, but every turn seemed the same. Trees, bushes, and paths all merged into one endless space. Suddenly he stopped, feeling something amiss. The forest around him was eerily quiet. There was no breeze, no sounds of animals. It felt like he had entered some other reality where the laws of nature no longer applied. Panic began to rise again. Ivan shouted, hoping someone would hear him. "Hey, is anyone here?" But his cry again drowned in silence. He felt fear engulfing him more and more. The forest seemed to be closing in on him, cutting off retreat. He had to keep going, despite all of this. He couldn't afford to stop or give up. Summoning his last strength, Ivan continued on his way, hoping to find some way out of this nightmare. He knew he had to fight to the end, despite all the difficulties and fears haunting him in this mysterious forest. Ivan walked through the forest, with each step feeling the reality around him becoming more distorted. Tree shadows seemed alive, and their branches, twisting, seemed to try to grab him. Suddenly he began to hear strange sounds. Voices, at first quiet and barely discernible, began to grow louder and clearer. They sounded like whispers, turning into an eerie choir, surrounding him from all sides. "Who's there?" Ivan shouted, turning towards the sounds. But the voices sometimes approached and sometimes receded, leaving him in complete bewilderment and fear. He quickened his pace, trying to get away from them, but the sounds followed him, no matter how hard he tried to escape. Passing between the trees, Ivan again saw the same strange symbol on the bark, the distorted pentagram with a goat's skull. His heart raced faster. He had seen this symbol before, but he was sure he was going in a different direction. This only intensified his anxiety and the feeling that the forest was playing with him like a predator with its prey. Dusk began to fall, and Ivan realized that night would soon come. The temperature dropped sharply, and he began to shiver from the cold. He knew he needed to light a fire to warm himself and prevent himself from freezing. Ivan started looking for dry branches and leaves, trying to build a small fire. When everything was ready, he reached into his pocket for matches or a lighter, but there was none. Ivan frantically searched all his pockets but found nothing. Panic began to grip him. He realized that without fire, he wouldn't survive in this cold and eerie darkness. "Damn!" he shouted, hitting the ground with his fist. "Why now of all times?" Despair washed over him. The voices around him became even louder, as if mocking his helplessness. He tried to gather his thoughts, thinking of other ways to start a fire. But the cold and fear paralyzed his mind. Ivan sat on the ground, leaning his back against a tree, and hugged his knees. Darkness closed in, and the forest became increasingly menacing. There was not a single glimmer of light around him, only ominous whispers and mysterious symbols, emphasizing the unreality of what was happening. He closed his eyes, trying to concentrate and gather his strength. An inner voice told him not to give up, to fight to the end. But what to do when the surrounding world turns into a nightmare with no way out? Ivan opened his eyes and saw darkness closing in around him. Night had come, and now he was alone in this frightening and anomalous forest. He knew he had to find a way to survive, no matter what. His strength began to leave him, but Ivan wasn't about to give up. He kept fighting, even when it seemed that all was lost. Ivan continued to wander in the darkness, feeling lost and lonely in this endless forest. Suddenly he heard twigs crunching and saw a faint light of a campfire in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. Perhaps these were other people who could help him. With a surge of hope, he quickened his steps, approaching the source of light. But as he drew closer, his heart froze with horror. At the edge of the clearing, illuminated by the campfire, stood a strange figure. Its features were twisted and distorted, and a goat's skull was fixed atop its head. Ivan held his breath, hardly believing his eyes. Behind the figure stood a group of people dressed in black robes. They were performing some strange ritual, raising their hands and making inhuman sounds. Fear paralyzed Ivan. He couldn't look away from what was happening, as if in a trance, watching as one of the robed figures approached the center of the clearing, where a terrifying idol stood and offered something akin to a sacrifice. His pulse quickened when he realized it was something alive. He noticed how other members of the group began to dance around the campfire, chanting ominous hymns. Goosebumps ran over Ivan's skin, and he realized he was in the midst of something terrible and incomprehensible. The sense of danger made him tremble, but he couldn't tear himself away from what was happening. Gasping for breath, Ivan decisively stepped back, trying not to make a sound. He needed to get out of here as quickly as possible before they noticed him. With each step, fear became more oppressive, and he prayed they wouldn't notice him, so he could escape from this nightmare unfolding right before his eyes. Ivan realized he needed to escape from this nightmare. Fear and horror made him act instinctively. He turned around and fled, trying to leave behind this terrible scene. His legs moved automatically, step by step, distancing him from the danger. He felt cold sweat running down his back, and his heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of his chest. Ivan couldn't see where he was running. His only goal was to escape, to save his life. But suddenly the figure with the goat skull turned and pointed straight at him. Ivan stopped, his eyes filled with helpless despair. The cultists noticed him and began to pursue him. They shouted incomprehensible words and chased after him like a pack of predators. Ivan felt adrenaline rushing through his veins, giving him inhuman strength. The pain that had previously overwhelmed him seemed to fade into the background, focusing his attention only on one thing: to run, to run, to run, to run. He didn't feel tiredness, didn't feel pain, only the swift impact of his feet on the ground and the wind blowing on his face. Stumbling and falling, he instantly got up and continued his run, without looking back. Thick vegetation became obstacles in his path, but Ivan overcame them as if they were insignificant hurdles. He knew they were getting closer and closer, but he couldn't allow himself to stop. His life was at stake, and he was ready to fight for it until the end. He looked ahead, trying to find some sign of salvation, but the forest seemed endless and hopeless. Time lost its meaning, and he continued to run, like an immortal hero trying to escape death. But even in the most hopeless moments, he didn't give up. His will was stronger than ever, and he was ready to fight to his last breath to survive. Almost exhausted and worn out, Ivan finally found shelter behind a fallen tree. He huddled, pressing himself to the ground, listening to his own breath, which echoed loudly in his ears. His heart was beating so hard it felt like it would leap out of his chest. He prayed that the creature wouldn't notice his hiding place. But his hopes were shattered when the dark figure with the goat skull approached his hiding spot. Ivan's heart stopped when his gaze met the empty, inscrutable eyes of the creature. The creature approached the tree behind which Ivan was hiding and suddenly stopped. It seemed to sense that someone was nearby. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like it could be torn apart. Suddenly, the creature turned its head, its skull facing in Ivan's direction. Ivan curled up even tighter, trying to make himself as small as possible. But his efforts were in vain. The creature approached him, its presence incredibly menacing. It reached out its hand towards him, and Ivan felt a searing pain piercing his skin. He screamed in agony as his hand seemed to ignite in flames. But the creature didn't let go. Its grip was ironclad and unrelenting. Ivan broke free from its powerful grasp and fled, ignoring the pain and weakness engulfing his body. He knew he had to escape. His own survival was at stake. Running forward, Ivan noticed strange scratched symbols on the trees, slowly closing in on him. They seemed like ancient symbols, filled with evil and horror. He couldn't understand what they meant, but he knew he had to flee from them, as if from the devil himself. Despite the pain and fear, Ivan kept running, aiming for somewhere he could find shelter. But in this insane forest, where every turn could bring a new horror, he didn't know where to go. His only hope was that he could escape this nightmare and return to the real world, where he was just a man, not a toy in the hands of darkness. Ivan ran as if from death, overcoming each step with the last remnants of his strength. But suddenly he felt someone approaching from behind. He glanced back and saw one of the cultists lunging at him, ready to attack. With a contorted face and eyes full of madness, the cultist knocked Ivan off his feet and pinned him to the ground. Ivan felt the weight of the body on top of him. His breathing became difficult. But he didn't give up without a fight. The strength of desperation seized him, and he began to fight back, despite his wounds and exhaustion. Second by second passed, and Ivan fought for his life, deflecting blows and trying to free himself. Finally, he managed to turn around and throw the cultist off him. At that moment, he noticed a strange scar on the attacker's hand in the shape of a goat skull. Ivan was horrified, realizing that these cultists were not just insane fanatics but members of some sinister cult, where each person immortalized their belonging to this darkness through such scars. It made him fight even harder for his life and freedom. With the strength of desperation, Ivan broke free from the cultist's grasp and got to his feet. He didn't give the enemy a second to recover and fled, not looking back. His heart was beating like a drum, and his lungs burned from his frantic breathing. He heard the cultist yelling and cursing behind him, but he paid no attention. His only goal was to survive and escape from this nightmare. With each step, he felt closer to freedom, to reality, where there was no place for such horrors. He ran, not looking back, tearing through the forest like a whirlwind, almost forgetting about the pain, fatigue, and fear. His thoughts were only about salvation, about leaving this nightmare far behind. Ivan kept running until his legs gave out. He felt the strength leaving his body, and each step became heavier and heavier. But he didn't give up. He knew he had to keep going until he reached safety. Suddenly, through the thickets of trees, he saw the lights of a highway. Striving towards them, he ran as if doomed. When he emerged onto the road, passing people noticed him. They stopped to help him. Ivan was exhausted, but with the help of these strangers, he managed to make it home. He told them he had lost his memory due to an accident in the forest, to avoid explanations about what had really happened. Gradually, Ivan began to recover. His body healed from the wounds, and his mind slowly started to return. He tried not to think about the nightmares he had experienced in the forest, but they continued to haunt him in his dreams. Several days after returning home, Ivan noticed something strange on his hand. A scar, similar to the one he had seen on the cultist in the forest, began to appear on his skin. He paled with horror, trying to understand what it meant and how he could have received such a wound. But he couldn't find an answer. All his memories of what happened in the forest seemed locked in his subconscious, inaccessible to his mind. He decided not to share this information with anyone, fearing that he might be accused of madness or something else. Ivan tried to accept his new reality and move on, but the shadow of the horrors he had experienced in the forest was always there, reminding him that he couldn't forget. For Ivan, returning from the forest was the beginning of a nightmare that seemed endless. In his dreams, it seemed like he was still in the dark woods, where the shadow of the creature with the goat skull pursued him, making him run, 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 run. But the nightmares didn't stay only in his dreams. Suddenly, Ivan began to see this creature in real life. He could see it standing in the corner of the room when he was alone, or glimpsing among the passers-by on the street. Every time he turned to look, it disappeared, as if it had never existed. These intrusive visions began to unsettle Ivan. He began to doubt his sanity, questioning the reality of what was happening. His mind was plunged into madness that he couldn't explain. With each passing day, the visions became more intense and terrifying. Ivan felt madness engulfing him, like a web from which there was no escape. He began to lose sleep and appetite, his thoughts constantly overwhelmed by fear and anxiety. But even in his madness, Ivan had one desire: to return to that forest where this nightmare began. He felt that there, in the darkness and solitude, he might find answers to his questions, unravel the mystery of this creature with the goat skull. This desire became his obsession. He started studying maps and gathering information about the place where he lost his memory. He felt he had to go back there to understand what happened and perhaps rid himself of these cursed visions. But every time he tried to gather the courage to go into the forest, he stopped, overcome by fear and uncertainty. The struggle between his desire to unravel the mystery and fear of the unknown tormented his soul, causing him agony in his own madness. For Ivan, each day became more and more unbearable. The mysterious entity that haunted him in his nightmares became his constant companion, intruding into his mind even at the most inappropriate moments. But the strangest thing was that he began to feel an irresistible urge to return to the dead forest. This urge was so strong that he began to act against his will. One fine day, he discovered that he was involuntarily drawing signs he had seen in the forest, associated with the cult. He woke up to find them etched on his hands, on the walls of his room, sometimes even on paper that he couldn't remember drawing. This filled him with horror and fear. Ivan realized he was losing control of himself, that some force beyond his understanding was leading him on. But despite all his efforts to resist, he understood he couldn't withstand this call. He decided to try to escape his fate by buying a new car and moving to another city, far from the places that had become hell for him. But even this didn't help. One day, coming back from work, he found himself on the road leading to the dead forest. Ivan's heart froze with horror when he saw what he feared most. The creature with the goat skull stood at the edge of the forest, surrounded by its minions, the same ones he had seen in his nightmares. He realized it wasn't just a vision or hallucination, it was reality from which he couldn't escape. Ivan understood that he had to move forward, that he couldn't evade his destiny. Although fear and anxiety overwhelmed him, he felt he had no choice. He entered the forest, leaving behind his new life, submitting to the inexplicable force that dragged him to this place again and again. Every summer, as the heat begins to wane and the days grow a bit cooler, Jack and Mark, two old friends, embark on their annual fishing trip. It's not just about fishing, it's their way of escaping the hustle and bustle of the city, breaking free from everyday worries, and enjoying nature and each other's company. They leave for 2 days and 2 nights, immersing themselves in the forest wilderness by the river, where the only sounds are the rustle of leaves and the murmur of water. Every year they return to the same spot and secluded corner by the river, surrounded by dense forest. They stumbled upon this place by chance many years ago, and since then it has become their permanent refuge. Here they set up their camp pitch tents, build a fire, and prepare everything they need for fishing. Not far from their fishing spot lies an abandoned village they dubbed the Last Stand. This place has always piqued their curiosity and instilled a bit of fear. The village seems frozen in time, its old houses gradually crumbling, and the streets overgrown with grass and shrubs. Rumor has it that the last residents left about 10 years ago, and since then no one has lived there. Have you ever wondered why they all left? Mark once asked, gazing at the empty houses. "I don't know," Jack replied, examining the old buildings. "But it looks like life was once bustling here. Maybe tough times came." They often wandered through the village, trying to imagine how people lived here, what they did, what joys and sorrows they had. These walks always left them with a strange feeling, as if they were touching something that should have remained in the past. The first day of fishing usually starts early in the morning. Jack and Mark quickly get ready, trying to leave the city before dawn to secure the best spot on the riverbank. By the time they arrive, the forest is already bathed in soft morning light, and the air is filled with freshness. They unpack their things, set up tents, and start preparing for fishing. "Remember last year when I caught that huge pike?" Jack laughs, adjusting his fishing rod. "Thought the line wouldn't hold." "Yeah, and how you bragged about it for a week afterward," Mark teased, lighting the fire. "But I must admit, we had a splendid dinner." They spend the day sitting by the river with their fishing rods, occasionally exchanging jokes and stories. Fishing for them is not just an opportunity to catch fish, but also a way to distract, relax, and enjoy the simple joys of life. By evening, they return to the camp, cook dinner over the fire, and enjoy the solitude. In moments like these, the city bustle seems like a distant dream, and the forest and river a true reality. On the second day, their fishing adventure continues, but they also decide to spend some time in the last stand. They walk through the thickets, making their way along paths that gradually disappear into the dense grass. The empty house windows gaze at them like lifeless eyes, and the silence here seems particularly thick. "I wonder what happened to these people," Mark asks again. "Maybe they left in search of a better life," Jack speculates. "Or maybe time took its toll." Returning to the river, they continue fishing, enjoying the last hours of their trip. In the evening, under the stars, they sit by the fire again, discussing everything that happened over the past year and planning how they will spend their next fishing trip. "Until next year," Jack says, raising his cup of hot coffee. "Until next year," agrees Mark, feeling how 2 days in nature have recharged his energy and given him strength for new endeavors. These trips have become an integral part of their lives, a symbol of friendship and unity with nature. And despite all the hardships and worries, they always find time for their annual fishing trip, knowing that it is here, by the river, that they find true peace and harmony. Every year, heading out on their annual fishing trip, Jack and Ethan find the long-awaited peace and enjoyment in the simple pleasures of nature. Their tradition encompasses not only the fishing itself, but everything associated with it, from gathering firewood to cozy evenings by the fire. On the morning of the first day, after the tents were pitched and the fishing gear prepared, the friends head to the river. The river here flowed slowly, its calm surface reflecting clouds and tall trees leaning over the water. Jack and Ethan cast their lines, savoring the quietness and occasional splashes of fish. "I hope this year we catch something big," Jack said, adjusting the line on his fishing rod. "We surely will," Ethan replied, sitting down on a log. "Remember that pike I caught last year? I think its mom is still lurking around here somewhere." Time on the fishing trip flew by unnoticed. The friends exchanged life stories, joked, and reminisced about past trips. Sometimes they simply stayed silent, enjoying nature and the sounds of the forest. As the sun began to set, Ethan decided it was time to gather firewood for the fire. He took an axe and headed into the woods. Wood gathering had always been a special ritual for him, allowing him to be alone with himself and the forest. Ethan walked along familiar paths, choosing dry branches and fallen trees. He always found some special pleasure in this activity: the rustle of leaves underfoot, the smell of wood, and the feeling of peace that being in the forest brought. After collecting enough firewood, he returned to the camp and started the fire. Meanwhile, Jack prepared the fish they had caught during the day. Soon, the smell of fish sizzling on the coals mixed with the scent of fresh forest air. "You're a master at making campfires," Jack praised, watching Ethan skillfully kindle the fire. "I'm always amazed at how quickly you handle it." "The secret is to choose the right firewood and not to rush," Ethan replied, smiling. "And the fire itself will do the rest." Evenings by the campfire were special. Amidst the crackle of burning wood and the light of the stars, friends continued their conversations. They shared childhood stories, discussed plans for the future, and pondered life. Sometimes Jack would bring his guitar, and they would sing old songs they knew since youth. You know, in moments like these, life seems to slow down, Ethan said, watching the sparks dance in the fire. Everything that truly matters is right here, right now. You're right, Jack agreed, taking a sip of hot tea. These trips remind us of what's truly important: friends, nature, and simple joys. On the second day, their retreat continued in the same spirit. They went fishing again, enjoying the morning coolness and the quietness of the river. After lunch, Ethan went for firewood again, while Jack took care of preparing dinner. Their rhythm was smooth and harmonious, as if they were part of the forest and the river. When the evening of the second day arrived, friends gathered around the campfire once more. This time they discussed their plans for the next year and the dreams they wished to fulfill. "I'll always make time for these trips," Ethan said, gazing into the fire, "no matter how busy we get." "This is our time," Jack affirmed. "Here we can be ourselves, without any hustle and bustle." The last night passed in silence and tranquility. In the morning, after packing their belongings and leaving the place as clean as they found it, Jack and Ethan headed back to the city. But the memories of the 2 days spent by the river would stay with them throughout the year, reminding them of the importance of simple joys and true friendship. During the second day of their stay by the river, as the sun was already beginning to set, Jack and Ethan were enjoying another quiet evening by the campfire. They were preparing dinner from the freshly caught fish when they suddenly heard rustling in the bushes. They tensed up, exchanged glances, and stood up, trying to understand who or what could disturb their peace. From behind the trees emerged an old man with a thick gray beard and in shabby clothes. He was of short stature but carried himself with confidence and dignity. An old trench coat hung on his shoulders, and in his hands he held a worn leather bag and a bottle. "Good evening, young gentleman," the old man said, smiling. "Didn't expect to encounter anyone in these parts, did you?" Jack and Ethan exchanged surprised looks at the unexpected guest. Jack was the first to break the silence. "Good evening," he replied. "My name is Jack, and this is my friend Ethan. We come here for fishing every year. And you must be local." "Correctly guessed," the old man nodded. "My name is Timothy. I live nearby, in that abandoned village you might have seen." Jack and Ethan, recalling their curiosity about the abandoned village they dubbed the Last Stand, immediately realized that they were facing its only inhabitant. "You live in the Last Stand?" Ethan asked with interest. "We thought nobody lived there anymore." "That's right," sighed Timothy. "The last residents left about 10 years ago. Only I remained. I live here quietly, though without conveniences. Fresh air, nature, everything needed for a long life." He smiled and lifted his bottle. "So I decided to visit you and offer some of my moonshine, made from berries and herbs I gather in the forest. Will you accept an old man's treat?" Jack and Ethan exchanged glances. On one hand, they weren't sure if they should accept a treat from a stranger, but on the other hand, they didn't want to offend the old man. "Why not?" said Jack, reaching for the bottle. "We're glad for the company. Tell us, how do you manage living here alone?" Timothy sat by the fire, and they passed the bottle around. The moonshine tasted strong and robust, but pleasant. Timothy began his story. "Once our village thrived," he began, gazing into the fire. "Farms, fields, people worked, lived in harmony. But with time, everything changed. The youth left for the cities, fields were abandoned, farms dismantled. The remaining elderly gradually departed. I stayed alone." Listening to the old man's story, Ethan tossed wood into the fire, keeping it going. Timothy continued. "You know, there's no electricity or gas here, but I don't complain. The air is clean, food from the garden, and illnesses pass me by. Perhaps it's because of nature, or maybe just habit." "Do you ever get scared?" Ethan asked, pouring himself some more moonshine. "At times," Timothy admitted. "Especially at night when the wind howls through the empty houses. But I've grown accustomed. Nature and solitude have become my companions." As time passed, Jack and Ethan felt the conversation with Timothy bringing them closer to understanding another, less hectic life. They asked questions, and the old man willingly answered, sharing his thoughts and memories. Finally, as the night sky became fully adorned with stars, Timothy rose. "Thank you for the company, young men," he said, smiling. "I'll head back to my village now. Hope we'll meet again." "Thank you for the story," and the treat, replied Jack. "Take care, Timothy." The old man nodded and slowly disappeared into the night, leaving Jack and Ethan to ponder his words and their own lives in the city. The evening ended in silence, which seemed more profound and meaningful to them after meeting Timothy. The next day, after their encounter with Timothy, Jack and Ethan sat by the fire again. The day passed calmly, with successful fishing and long walks in the surroundings. The evening air was fresh and cool, and the sky was studded with stars. The crackling of the fire and the sounds of the night forest created the perfect atmosphere for a heartfelt conversation. "You know, Jack," Ethan began, breaking the long silence, "I don't think I'll be able to come for our annual fishing trip next year." Jack looked at his friend in surprise. They hadn't missed this event for many years, so such a statement sounded unexpected. "Why?" he asked. "Work." Ethan nodded, smiling sadly. "Yes, projects keep piling up, deadlines are tight. The management demands constant presence. There's hardly any time for myself. Even now, I could barely manage to spare these couple of days." Jack shook his head, gazing into the flames. "I understand. But you've always talked about how important it is to find time for living and relaxation. This place, these moments, they're like a breath of fresh air. They give us strength to carry on." Ethan sighed, agreeing. "You're right, Jack. We get so caught up in work and everyday worries that we forget how important it is to simply stop and enjoy the moment. Yesterday's meeting with Timothy made me think. He lives in complete solitude, without all the comforts we're used to. Yet he looks happy. Maybe that's what we're missing." Jack nodded, realizing that their annual fishing trips weren't just about fun, but a genuine necessity. "Maybe we should make such outings more often," he suggested. "Not necessarily for fishing. Just get out of the city, turn off our phones, forget about work for a while. Life is too short to spend it in perpetual haste." Ethan smiled, feeling relieved after this conversation. "You're right. I'll try to find a way to better balance work and leisure. After all, if not us, then who will take care of our time?" They fell silent, listening to the night sounds of the forest and the crackling of the fire. Another night filled with tranquility and unity with nature lay ahead of them. When they first met Timothy, his appearance and stories raised numerous questions for them. Now, sitting by the fire and digesting what they had heard, they understood his life better. "Abandoned village," Ethan murmured, recalling Timothy's story. "How does he manage to live there alone?" Timothy explained to them that he had been living in the lasting village for many years. After all the other residents left the village, he decided to stay. He couldn't leave, having become attached to these places. However, to survive in such conditions, he had to show ingenuity. "I've arranged my accommodation in the cellar of one of the old houses," Timothy explained. "The above-ground buildings became dilapidated; they could collapse at any moment. The cellar, on the other hand, is sturdy, deep, and protects from bad weather." He proudly showed them his modest living conditions, a neat, cozy space underground where he stored food supplies, tools, and a small stove for heating. This place became his sanctuary, where he felt safe. "There's nobody within 200 miles," Timothy said. "I'm the only one left living here. Fresh air, nature, this is all I need. I have my own food from the garden, and I've learned to find ways for everything else." Timothy's life seemed completely different to them, but in his stories they heard not complaints, but contentment and acceptance. He had found his own path, which, though difficult, brought him joy and satisfaction. "Sometimes loneliness can be heavy," he admitted, "but it also brings freedom. I live as I please, without depending on anyone. That, perhaps, is the most valuable." Jack and Ethan listened to him with admiration, realizing that one could be happy even in such conditions, finding joy in simple things. Timothy's story became a lesson for them, making them reflect on their own lives and what truly matters. In the dark evening forest, by the light of the campfire, Jack and Ethan listened with astonishment to Timothy's tales of his life in the abandoned village. When he mentioned the lack of basic amenities, both friends felt a bit awkward. "Wait, hold on," Jack interjected when Timothy finished describing his life. "Are you serious? No electricity? No gas? How do you even live without that?" Timothy just smiled, as if about to answer this question for the 1000th time. "Yes, of course it might seem unusual to you city boys," he began, gazing into the campfire. "But for me, it has become routine. At first it was challenging, of course. But then I realized that fresh air and quality, natural food from the garden, that's what really matters." Ethan nodded, thinking about how often they took all these things for granted: electricity, gas, conveniences. "And what about winter?" he asked. "Isn't it cold without heating?" "Winter is indeed tougher," Timothy admitted, "but I've learned to make fires and I have warm clothing. Nature always provides us with the tools for survival, we just need to learn to use them." Jack looked at him appreciatively. "You found your own path," he said. "But still, how do you know if something happens? No connection, no help." Timothy grimaced, looking thoughtfully into the fire. "It's risky, of course," he confessed, "but I prefer to live as I please, even if it involves certain risks. But believe me, when you're surrounded by nature and simplicity, you start to see life differently. It becomes more whole, more true." Ethan and Jack exchanged glances, thoughtfully listening to Timothy's words. This evening in the forest made them reflect on their own values and what truly matters for a fulfilling life. Under the thick canopies of the towering trees, amidst the whisper of leaves and the murmur of the stream, Timothy began to tell the story of the fate of the abandoned village he called home. "It was a long time ago," he began, his gaze immersed in memories. "People here lived a simple but happy life. The land was fertile, and the harvests brought abundance." He sighed, as if resurrecting the past. "But then things began to change. People started leaving, and the fields remained unplanted. The farm, which once was the heart of our community, fell into ruin and was overrun by grass." Timothy continued his story, as if revisiting dark pages of the past. "When resources and opportunities dwindled, people began to fight for survival. The remaining residents resorted to desperate measures to hang on. Sometimes it was theft, sometimes fights over food. But we were all in this together, trying to survive in this unforgiving world." Timothy paused, allowing his words to fade into the silence of the forest. "But even in the darkest times, we found solace in simple joys of life. Gatherings with friends by the campfire, fishing by the river, sunrises over the treetops, all of these gave us strength and hope." In his voice, there was sadness, but also something else: hope that even in an abandoned village, one could find beauty and meaning in life. The harsh winter gripped the abandoned village with its cold, piercing everything around with its icy breath. Frosty winds seeped through the cracks in ancient walls, and even the earth seemed frozen in anticipation of spring. Timothy sighed, recalling that dreadful period. "It was the toughest winter I remember," he began, wrapping himself in a warm cloak to fend off the chill. "The frost was so intense that even the air froze in our lungs, making each breath feel heavy and painful." He looked at his listeners, seeing in their eyes reflections of his own fears and worries. "My garden, which I tended so diligently, turned into dead soil," Timothy continued, recalling the merciless nature. "Not a single tree bore fruit, not a single bush gave us hope for a harvest. I watched as my food supplies dwindled before my eyes, like water in the thawing ice. The winter nights grew longer, and food supplies diminished with each passing day." Timothy remembered how his hunger became sharper, how every piece of bread seemed like the last mirage in the desert. But the worst was the feeling of helplessness, standing on the edge of the abyss, ready to fall at any moment, he whispered, as if battling with ghosts of the past. "The abyss of hunger pulled me in stronger and stronger, and I realized that if I didn't find help, I would remain here forever, buried under the weight of my own mistakes and fears." But even in the darkest moments, Timothy found strength to fight. The thirst for survival fueled his heart, giving him the power to keep moving forward. A summer evening, imbued with the sense of blooming nature and the murmuring of the river, witnessed an unexpected turn of events in Timothy's life. Sitting on the riverbank, he delved into his thoughts, trying to find a way out of the hopeless situation the abandoned village found itself in. Suddenly, like lightning in a clear sky, an idea illuminated his mind, an idea that could change his life. But he couldn't immediately share this decision with anyone else. It was too intimate, too personal, as if the key to his survival was found not in the world around him, but deep within himself. Timothy continued to remain silent, as if delving into the essence of his thoughts, exploring every corner, every twist. He knew that his decision might evoke mixed feelings in his friends, but he was confident in its rightness, in its necessity. And when he finally mustered the courage to share his thoughts, his narrative engulfed them like a wave crashing onto the shore. His words carried certainty and determination, mixed with mystery and enigma. He didn't disclose details, didn't speak of what exactly he had conceived, but his voice sounded convincing, as if he knew he had made the right choice. And for his friends, it became not only a mystery, but also a subject for contemplation. What could have changed Timothy so much? What secrets did he harbor in his heart? Perhaps the answers to these questions were buried deep within his soul, and only time could reveal all the cards of this mysterious story. By the campfire, in the cozy atmosphere, Timothy unveils his secret, as if opening a box containing the most dreadful treasure. His words, permeated with the cold reality of survival, freeze his friends, as if wooden figures in a horror theater. The concoction he prepared, like a deadly trap, stealthily penetrates their bodies, depriving them of the ability to move and even think. Ethan's and Timothy's eyes, distorted with horror, realize that they've fallen into a trap they set themselves. Every sip taken from the hands of the kindly old man becomes a sentence. But when the last sip is consumed, and their bodies no longer obey their will, the ominous silhouette of Timothy emerges from the shadows, holding an axe. Ethan realizes that he's become a victim of his trust, a pawn in the game of ruthless survival. The gazes of the two friends meet for the last time, like reflections of fear and despair. Timothy's hand rises, and the axe gleams in the flames of the campfire, like the sword of destiny, ready to deliver the final blow. This is the end of their story, a story of friendship and survival, concluded tragically with betrayal and death. In the forest, under the cover of night, the last breaths echo, and their echo will forever remain in this secluded corner of the abandoned village, bearing witness that in the world, only the strongest survive, and trust can become the most dangerous trap. Alexander and Daniil decided to spend the evening with friends around a campfire in the depths of a picturesque forest. The sunlight filtering through the branches of the trees was already beginning to dim as they set out on their journey. Daniil confidently led the way, remembering every turn of the path he had walked many times before. Alexander followed him, enjoying the fresh air and the birdsong. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, the forest began to fill with shadows and mysterious sounds. Twilight quickly descended, and the path became less distinct. However, Daniil was confident in his abilities and continued to lead his friend forward. They chatted animatedly, anticipating the evening by the campfire with friends. When the forest was completely shrouded in darkness, Daniil stopped and looked around with a slight unease. He suddenly realized that the surrounding landscape was unfamiliar to him. The path that had seemed so clear just moments ago had now disappeared among the trees and bushes. Alexander noticed this too and began to feel nervous. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" he asked, trying to hide his anxiety. "I think so," Daniil replied, but there was uncertainty in his voice. They tried to backtrack along the same path they had come, but in the darkness the forest seemed entirely different. Every turn looked the same, and soon they realized they were lost. Daniil took out his phone to check the map, but the screen showed no signal. Alexander checked his phone too, the same result. "It seems we're far from civilization," Alexander remarked, trying not to panic. The friends sat down on a fallen tree, trying to remember in which direction they might have deviated from the route. The forest seemed hostile and mysterious. Nighttime sounds, rustling leaves, the cries of nocturnal birds, and a distant howl heightened their anxiety. At that moment, every rustle seemed ominous. "We need to stay calm," Daniil said, trying to reassure his friend. "Let's try to remember how we came and find some landmarks." They decided to move forward, hoping to find familiar places. They walked cautiously, listening to the sounds and trying to discern the path in the darkness. Every tree looked like the previous one, but they kept going, encouraging each other. After some time, they reached a small clearing where the moonlight helped them orient themselves a bit. Daniil remembered seeing this place before. They felt hopeful. "Look, it seems to be the clearing we passed by," he exclaimed. Alexander breathed a sigh of relief. Now they had a chance to find their way. They moved forward with renewed energy, hoping to soon hear the voices of their friends and see the light of the campfire. Thus began their unforgettable night in the forest, full of adventures and trials. They still had a long way to go, but now they knew they could escape this woodland trap together. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in warm shades of orange and pink, Alexander looked at the setting sun and suggested, "Let's head towards the sunset. Maybe we'll come out to the edge of the forest or to a river." Daniil frowned, looking in the direction Alexander pointed. "Maybe we will," he said thoughtfully, "but it will be dark soon, and we might lose our bearings." They continued to move forward, and with each step, the forest grew darker and denser. The shadows of the trees stretched out like long, thin fingers, as if trying to grasp the lost travelers. Soon it became difficult to distinguish the path, and a shadow of worry fell upon the faces of the friends. Daniil suddenly remembered a recent conversation with Alina when she told him about how not to get lost in the forest. She said it was important to mark unusual landmarks and to backtrack if you felt lost. "Wait," Daniil stopped and turned to his friends. "Alina told me that it's important to mark some unusual landmarks. Maybe we should find a noticeable tree or rock and try to remember them to return later if needed." Alexander looked at him skeptically but nodded. "All right, let's give it a try, but we need to hurry before it gets completely dark." As they continued to move forward, the tension in the air began to rise. The forest seemed mysterious and ominous. The nighttime sounds grew louder, intensifying the feeling of unease. "Have you heard about that recent trend?" Daniil suddenly broke the silence, disrupting the quiet. "People deliberately come into the forest to end their lives." Alexander stopped and looked at him incredulously. "Are you serious? Is this some kind of joke?" Daniil shook his head, his face serious. "No, it's true. I read about it in the news. People get lost, lose hope, and—" "Enough," Alexander interrupted, visibly annoyed. "You're just trying to scare us. It's all nonsense." But from Daniil's expression, it was clear he wasn't joking. He bit his lip and continued to walk, glancing around. "Why did you even bring this up?" Marina asked, looking at Daniil with concern. "We're already scared enough." "Just wanted to warn you," he replied quietly. "The forest can be dangerous if you don't know where you're going." The mood of the group has noticeably shifted. Even Alexander, who was usually the boldest and most resolute, began to feel nervous. They walked on, trying to stay closer to each other, feeling the darkness closing in around them like a huge, dense cloak covering everything living. "Let's just focus on finding the way," Alexander suggested, attempting to inject confidence back into his voice. "If we stick together, we'll get out of here." But Daniil's thoughts still lingered on Alina's stories and the horrifying tales of people getting lost in the woods forever. He couldn't shake the feeling that they needed to be more cautious. The darkness thickened, and every shadow seemed ominous. Suddenly, Daniil stopped, listening intently. "What's wrong?" Alexander asked, looking at his friend. "Do you hear that?" Daniil whispered. "Someone is screaming." Alexander listened, but he heard nothing but the night sounds of the forest. "No, I don't hear anything," he replied, scanning their surroundings. "Are you sure?" Daniil nodded and, trembling, pulled out his phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam of light pierced the darkness, illuminating a small part of the forest ahead of them. "I have to check it out," he said, determination in his voice. "Wait, I'll come with you," Alexander replied, still doubtful but trusting his friend. They proceeded slowly, with Danil lighting the way. The tree shadows seemed to move like living creatures, and every sound grew louder and more unsettling. Minutes passed, and the forest grew gloomier. Suddenly, Danil's phone rang. He quickly answered and immediately heard a cry. "Danil, help." It was Alina. Her voice was full of fear and desperation. Danil paled instantly, his heart racing. "Alina, where are you?" he shouted into the phone, but there was no response, only silence. Without hesitation, he dashed into the depths of the forest, lighting his way with the flashlight. Alexander followed, trying not to fall behind. "Danil, wait." "Stop," he shouted, but Danil was too focused on finding Alina to stop. They ran, yelling and listening, but the forest swallowed the sounds, making it feel like they were running into nothingness. Branches whipped their faces, tree roots snagged their feet, but Danil didn't stop. Panic consumed him entirely. Suddenly, Danil realized that no one was running behind him anymore. He turned around and realized that Alexander was gone. The forest around him was eerily silent, with only his own breathing and heartbeat breaking the dead silence. "Alexander." "Alina," he called out, but there was no answer. Danil stood alone in the darkness, trying to figure out which way to go. The frantic race through the forest had robbed him of his bearings, and now he didn't know where he was. Suddenly, realizing the hopelessness of the situation, he felt fear rising inside him like a cold wave. His mind raced for a solution, and he began to listen intently, hoping to hear Alina's cry again, or at least Alexander's footsteps. But the forest remained silent, swallowing all sounds. In that moment, Danil realized he was lost. Alexander stood in the darkness, staring at the spot where Danil had disappeared. He called out to him again and again, but all he heard in response was the eerie silence of the forest. Cold fear crept into his soul, and he began to wander through the woods, hoping to find his friend. The flashlight of his phone illuminated only small patches, leaving the rest of the world in impenetrable darkness. "Danil," he shouted, his voice growing more desperate. "Where are you?" Hours dragged on agonizingly. Alexander continued to wander, trying to orient himself by sounds and occasional landmarks, but the forest seemed like an endless labyrinth. He stumbled over roots, collided with branches, and occasionally fell, scraping his hands and face. Finally, realizing that continuing the search in the darkness was futile, he decided to stop. On a small patch of clear ground, he built a fire, using dry branches and leaves he found nearby. The bright flames warmed him a little and illuminated the surrounding space, driving away at least some of the terrifying darkness. "Danil, I'll find you," Alexander whispered, settling down by the fire. His eyes closed with exhaustion, and soon he drifted into a fitful sleep. Alexander woke up to a sudden jolt on his shoulder. He jumped up, feeling his heart racing wildly in his chest. Before him stood Danil, his face pale and haunted. "Danil," Alexander exclaimed, getting to his feet. "Where have you been? I've been searching for you all night." Danil slowly sank to the ground, his face filled with exhaustion and fear. "I've been wandering through the forest for 2 days," he said, his voice trembling. "I thought I saw strange things, people hanging from trees. It was horrible." Alexander sat down next to his friend, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. "Hanging people?" "Danil, are you sure it wasn't a hallucination?" he asked, searching Danil's eyes for signs of madness or fear. Danil shook his head. "I don't know," he replied softly. "The forest seemed to have gone mad. I wandered endlessly, trying to find a way out. All this time, I couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't." Alexander sighed, trying to calm himself down. He hugged his friend, feeling him tremble. "The important thing is that we're together again. We'll get out of here. We'll find our way back." Danil nodded weakly. They sat together by the fire, feeling the warmth and safety slowly returning. I thought I'd never find you, Alexander admitted, staring at the flames. Me too, Daniil replied softly. But now we're together, and together we'll make it through. They sat by the campfire, exchanging stories of what each of them had experienced during this time. The night went on, but now the darkness didn't seem as frightening when they had each other. Alex and Daniil sat by the campfire, sharing stories of their wanderings through the woods. But when Daniil mentioned that he had been wandering for 2 days, Alex frowned. 2 days, Alex asked. Daniil, that's impossible. We only got lost yesterday evening. Daniil looked at him with surprise. No, Alex, I'm sure it's been longer. My phone died and I was using the sun to navigate. There have been 2 sunsets and 2 sunrises. Alex, skeptically shaking his head, pulled out his phone. The screen showed that it was now the next day, confirming his words. Look for yourself, Alex said, handing his phone to Daniil. Yesterday was Monday, and now it's Tuesday. Daniil frowned and checked his phone. His screen indicated that it was Thursday. What the hell, Daniil muttered. My phone says it's Thursday today. Alex, hearing this, became wary. How is that possible, he asked, looking at his friend. Did you set the time yourself? Is this some kind of joke? Daniil, feeling frustration rising, shook his head. Alex, I didn't set anything. How could I influence things like sunrise and sunset? I saw with my own eyes how the days passed. Alex looked at him skeptically. Maybe you imagined it? You could have gotten lost and lost track of time. It's easy to get confused in the woods. Daniil tensed, feeling himself getting angry. No, Alex, you don't understand. I'm sure it's been longer. I saw the sun rise and set twice. Alex began to doubt his friend's sanity, but there was something too convincing in his words. If you're not joking, then what's going on, he asked, trying to find a rational explanation. Daniil sighed, his eyes searching for answers. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe there's something here that affects time. The forest. It seems strange, like it lives by its own rules. Alex bit his lip, thinking. He remembered all the oddities they had experienced during this time and began to doubt his certainty. Maybe, he said slowly. But how do we know what's real and what's not? Daniil shook his head, his face full of despair. I don't know, he repeated, but one thing I know for sure: we need to get out of here as soon as possible. Alex nodded, deciding not to argue further. They agreed to stick together and search for a way out despite all the strangeness. The forest was still dark and menacing, but now they were together, and that gave them hope. The night went on, and the forest around them seemed alive, filled with ominous shadows and whispers of the wind. Daniil sat by the campfire, nervously looking around. Finally, he couldn't hold it in and shared his fears with Alex. Alex, I have to tell you something, he began, his voice full of anxiety. Strange things are happening in the forest. I've seen the same dead body hanging multiple times. Alex frowned, his heart beating faster. What do you mean, he asked cautiously. I've seen him, Daniil continued, his voice trembling. At first, I thought it was just a discarded mannequin or something. But every time I tried to get closer, he disappeared. I can't reach him, no matter how hard I try. Alex frowned even more, feeling the chill of fear creeping under his skin. Daniil, maybe it's just a trick of light and shadows? The forest can create illusions, especially when you're scared and tired. Daniil shook his head, his eyes filled with horror. No, Alex, it's not just an illusion. I think it's my own body, like I'm seeing myself hanging from a tree. Daniil's words struck Alex like lightning. He felt fear rising inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He needed to support his friend, or the situation could spiral out of control. Daniil, I understand you're scared, Alex said gently, trying to sound as calm as possible. But we're together now, and we'll get through this. Let's sit by the fire, rest a bit, and try to calm down. Daniil looked at Alex, his eyes filled with confusion and fear, but he nodded. They sat closer to the fire, its warm flames calming them a bit, chasing away the darkness of the night. I don't know what's happening here, Alex admitted, trying not to show his fear. But we have to stay together and support each other. Maybe it's just our minds playing a cruel trick because of fatigue and stress. Daniil sighed deeply, his shoulders relaxing a little. Thank you, Alex, he said quietly. I'm so scared. Me too, Alex admitted, staring into the fire. But we'll get out of here. Hold on to me, and together we'll handle whatever oddities this place throws at us. They sat by the campfire, listening to the crackling of the wood and feeling the fear slowly recede under the warmth and light. Alex kept the conversation going, telling stories from the past, trying to distract his friend from dark thoughts. Internally, he battled his own sense of horror and confusion, but knew he had to be strong for Daniil. Time crawled by slowly, but together they began to find the strength to continue struggling against the forest's frightening mysteries. The campfire continued to crackle, illuminating their faces in the darkness. After a few minutes of silence, Daniil unexpectedly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small and furry. Alex, horrified to see that it was a dead squirrel. Look, Daniil said, offering the animal to Alex. We can eat it if things get really bad with food. Alex recoiled, his face contorted with disgust. Daniil, have you lost your mind? He exclaimed, pushing his friend's hand away. Why would you bring this? Daniil frowned, his expression seeming distant and stern. In the forest, you have to survive, Alex, he calmly replied. I found it dead. This is not a joke. We have to be prepared for any difficulties. Alex felt a chill creeping into his heart. Daniil had clearly changed during his time in the forest. He seemed like a different person, more ruthless and severe. Okay, just leave it for now, Alex said, trying not to show his fear. We'll think about it later. After a few hours of rest, the campfire began to die down. Alex and Daniil decided it was time to move on. They agreed to walk straight ahead, hoping to find a road or houses. We need to stick together and stay on course, Alex said, getting to his feet. If we keep going straight, sooner or later we should come across people. Daniil nodded in agreement. They packed up camp and began to move forward slowly, keeping their direction by the compass on Alex's phone. About an hour into their journey, Daniil suddenly stopped. His face went pale, his eyes widening with fear. Alex, look, he whispered, pointing ahead. There, hanging. Alex tensed and looked in the direction indicated. About 50 meters away, he indeed saw something resembling a figure hanging from a tree. His heart pounded faster. It's just an illusion. Daniil, he tried to reassure his friend, but there was uncertainty in his voice. We can't afford to be distracted. But Daniil was adamant. No, Alex, we have to go there. I feel like it's important. Please, trust me. Alex sighed, realizing arguing was futile. He nodded, and they began to cautiously approach the figure. As they approached closer, it became clear that it was indeed a hanged man. But as soon as they got closer, the figure began to disappear, as if dissolving into the air. Daniil stood there, stunned and frightened. Do you see? He whispered. I'm not crazy. This isn't an illusion. Something is happening in this forest, and we need to understand what. Alex sighed, trying to maintain composure. Okay, he said. Let's try to follow your visions. Maybe they'll really help us find a way out. They set off again, following Daniil's intuition and his strange visions. The forest around them remained eerie and mysterious, but now they had a plan, albeit one based on unclear and frightening things. When Alex and Daniil reached the indicated spot, Alex looked around carefully but saw nothing unusual. The forest around them seemed as dark and grim as everywhere else. Daniil, there's nothing here, Alex said, looking around. It's just the forest. Daniil, on the other hand, stood still, his eyes wide with horror. No, Alex, you don't understand, he exclaimed, his voice trembling. I see him, right there. It's me, hanging. Alex looked to where Daniil pointed, but he saw only tree shadows and bushes. Daniil, It's all in your imagination. We're tired, frightened. Our minds are playing cruel tricks on us. But Daniil didn't listen. He stood there, paralyzed with fear, tears streaming down his face. "You don't understand," he shouted. "This isn't an illusion. It's me, and he's calling me." Before Alex could react, Daniil suddenly pulled a knife from his pocket. Alex froze in place, unable to react. "Daniil, wait," he cried, reaching out to his friend. "Stop. This isn't real." But Daniil, consumed by his terror and convinced of the reality of his vision, resolutely plunged the knife into his own throat. Alex rushed to him, but it was too late. Blood gushed from the wound, and Daniil fell to the ground. "No, no." Daniil, Alex screamed, trying to stop the bleeding with his hands, but to no avail. Daniil weakly smiled, his eyes dimming. "Forgive me, Alex," he whispered. "I couldn't bear it anymore." Moments later, his body went limp, and he stopped breathing. Alex, overwhelmed with horror and grief, continued trying to save his friend, but he knew it was hopeless. He remained on his knees beside Daniil's body, unable to believe what had happened. The forest around them fell into a sinister silence again, and Alex felt the weight of loneliness and hopelessness. He hugged his friend, feeling the coldness of his body, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Forgive me, Daniil," he whispered, feeling the overwhelming horror and sorrow. "I couldn't save you." The night seemed endless, and Alex realized that now he not only had to find a way out of this accursed forest, but also deal with the pain of loss. Alex sat on the ground, holding his dead friend's body in his arms when something in the distance caught his eye. He strained his eyes and saw a silhouette hanging from a tree. Alex's heart stopped, and he stood up, not releasing the bloodied knife that had belonged to Daniil. The body hung nearby, swaying slightly in the wind. Alex, overcoming fear and inner trembling, slowly made his way to the tree. He felt goosebumps running down his spine, and his thoughts were muddled. "This can't be," he muttered to himself. "This simply can't be reality." As Alex approached closer, his eyes widened in horror and confusion. Hanging from the tree was a body dressed exactly like Daniil. The face was partially obscured by shadow, but Alex unmistakably recognized his friend. It was Daniil, hanged and dead. He looked back and saw that Daniil's body still lay on the ground, the knife in his neck, his blood already absorbed by the earth. "This can't be," Alex whispered, feeling the reality around him begin to crumble. Before him were two bodies of the same person, one hanging from a tree, the other lying on the ground. He couldn't comprehend how this was possible. Alex stood between the two bodies, his mind trying to find some explanation. He approached the body on the tree and cautiously touched the cold hand. The body was real, not an illusion. He felt the weight and coldness, understanding that it wasn't a product of his imagination. Alex took a step back, overwhelmed with panic and despair. He looked at the body on the ground, then again at the hanged Daniil. His mind oscillated between fear and attempting to find a rational explanation. He was trapped in a forest that played with his mind, depriving him of the ability to distinguish reality from unreality. "Daniil, what is this?" Alex whispered, his voice trembling. "What's happening here?" But there was no answer. The forest was silent, and the silence around him only intensified his horror. With each passing moment, Alex felt his sanity slipping further into the abyss of madness. He understood that he must find a way out of this nightmare, but now he had to do it alone, with horrifying visions and terrifying secrets hidden in the dark depths of the forest. Among the dark trees of the forest, muffled voices echoed. Alex lifted his head, listening intently. He could distinguish a female voice that seemed familiar. Alina, he thought, his heart beating faster. He slowly rose to his feet, leaving Daniil's bodies behind. Hope revived his soul, and he began to move in the direction from which the voices came. Every step was filled with heaviness and fear, but Alex kept going, clutching the knife in his hand. The voices grew louder, and the hope of rescue gave him strength. He peered into the darkness, trying to make out the source of the sounds. As he approached the source of the voices, They became more and more indistinct and blurred. The voices seemed to come from different directions, changing as he moved forward. Alex felt his confidence waning. He stopped, sighing heavily, and tried to focus. But the voices became increasingly vague and confusing, creating a sense of disorientation in his mind. "Alex, are you here?" The voices rang out again, but this time they seemed to come from completely different places. Alex cursed, his heart pounding with helplessness and fear. He desperately shouted in response, but his voice was lost in the deafening silence of the forest. He stood there in complete darkness, surrounded by his own fears and doubts. The forest whispered its mysterious secrets around him, and Alex realized that he was lost in this merciless environment, devoid of hope for rescue. Listening to the voices, Alex jumped to his feet and began to run in the direction from which they came. He felt he was close to salvation, that soon he would see Alina and Daniil, and all the nightmares of this forest would be left behind. But the closer he got, the stranger it became. "Alex, help!" Alina cried out. "Alex, where are you?" Daniil's voice echoed. Alex's heart raced faster, but when he reached the place where the voices were coming from, he found nobody. Instead, his cries echoed back, creating a sinister echo that made him feel even more lonely and desperate. "This can't be true," he thought, looking around. "They must be somewhere here." But there was no one. The voices were only a reflection of his own, a trap set by the forest to confuse him and deprive him of hope. In the dark shadows of the forest, Alex suddenly froze. Before him, hanging from a tree, was a body. He recoiled, his heart pounding with horror. The body was dressed in the same dirty clothes as his own. It was him. The horrific sight overwhelmed him, making his blood run cold. He couldn't believe his eyes. His own doppelganger, hanging from the tree, dead and lifeless, like a sinister omen of his own death. Breathing heavily, Alex stepped back, his eyes burning with horror. His mind refused to accept this nightmare as reality. He waved away the vision, desperately closing his eyes, hoping that when he opened them again, it would all disappear. But when he looked up again, his doppelganger still hung from the tree, filling him with horror. Alex's heart pounded even faster, and he turned, running away from this nightmare that pursued him in this cursed forest. The cold rain soaked his clothes, and the strong wind chilled him to the bone. Alex ran through the darkness of the forest, his steps unsteady, and the ground slippery from the rain. Suddenly his legs gave way, and he fell to the ground. Slipping, he hit his head on a tree root. Waves of pain pierced his consciousness, and soon everything turned black. When he came to, pain shot through his forehead, and blood ran down his face. Disorientation engulfed him, and he tried to examine his head. With agonizing effort, he rose to his feet, trying to focus. Alex continued his restless journey through the dark forest, his steps unsteady, and his mind shrouded in a thick veil of fear and pain. But suddenly he noticed something even more horrifying than the cold and darkness. Everywhere, like ghosts in the mist, nooses hung from tree branches. They swayed in the wind, like ominous omens of death. Alex froze, gazing at them, but they always remained in place, slowly swaying, as if beckoning him. "Nooses," he murmured, his heart racing. "This can't be a coincidence." The deeper he ventured into the forest, the more often he encountered these ominous signs. They seemed to pursue him, tempting him with death, reminding him of his weakness and hopelessness. Alex realized that something or someone wanted him to end his torment, but he refused to let himself be defeated. He continued to fight, despite everything standing in his way. But fear gripped him tighter as he realized that with each step, the forest was pulling him deeper into its dark embrace. Tired and weary, Alex suddenly heard a faint whisper that seemed familiar. He stopped, listening intently, and suddenly, as if from the depths of his own mind, he heard Daniil's voice. "Alex." "This is the end," the voice whispered, sounding ghostly and cold. Alex trembled. This voice was like a ghost from the past, reminding him of what was and what could have been. He felt a pang in his heart, realizing that all his hopes of rescue had been an illusion. "Daniil. Is that you?" he whispered, his voice weak and trembling. "Yes, it's me, Alex. We're both here, in this forest, in this noose of fate," the voice replied, filling him with horror and despair. Alex realized that the nooses hanging around him were a warning, foreseeing their fate. He swallowed hard, feeling fear engulfing him. Despite all his efforts, Alex found himself powerless against the unknown force that menacingly pulled him toward the noose. He struggled, he screamed, trying to break free, but every step toward freedom seemed futile. The force pulled him stronger and stronger, enveloping him like a spider's web, and he realized that this was the end. In the last moment, he closed his eyes, praying for salvation, for a miracle, but his prayers went unanswered. Agonizing pain shook his body as the noose tightened around his neck. His breath caught, his heart froze with horror. Darkness engulfed him, and he plunged into the abyss of uncertainty, highlighting the utter despair and hopelessness of the situation. Thus ended his struggle with the otherworldly force, and his cries remained unanswered in the endless expanse of the forest, where every tree seemed to beckon him, like death itself.